Welcome to the Advance Your Art podcast, where we talk about the journey from artist to entrepreneur and everything in between. You've worked hard to hone your craft. Now take it to the next level with tips, techniques, strategies, and routines used by successful artists to grow their businesses and careers. Now, let's get started and have some fun with your host, Yuri Cataldo.
Welcome to the show. How are you today?
Hi, Yuri. Thanks for having me on.
It's my absolute pleasure. I know it's been a little bit of a back and forth with us, but I'm so excited to have you on. You are a highly, prolific writer, and I'm very excited to hear about what you've been up to and what you're working on and kind of your process. But first, for the listeners who are not as familiar with your work as I am, please tell me about yourself.
Yeah, I've been writing books about personal development already 14 years. My name is John Vespasian. Most of my readers are in the US, also in the UK, Australia, and a bit spread all over the world. And I write about history from the perspective of personal development, personal finance, marketing. So what I do is I go through literally hundreds of biographies, hundreds of historical events, and I try to draw practical lessons that we can use today in the 21st century. Lessons in the field of practical psychology, practical philosophy, marketing, personal finance. So this is what I do, and this is a very weird approach to history, and a very weird approach to personal development. But when I started to write 10 years ago, I thought I could not find the kind of books I wanted to read, which are very practical, very factual. So I started to write one, and I sort of enjoy the process very much. So I've done 10 already, and I hope to be doing about one per year.
That's wonderful. So if you could, let's backtrack a little bit. Before you started writing your books, what first made you want? I know you mentioned that you couldn't find the books you were hoping to do, but what got you into writing, and what's your background that made you want to combine historical instances with psychology?
Yeah, my background in this context is I was a reader for decades, and I acquired skills in different areas, commercial skills, legal skills, language skills, through the years, through a commercial career. And then at a certain point I decided, okay, maybe I can write a book. And the way I did it was also quite unusual, because I just blocked 4 weeks during the summer holiday and said, okay, I'm going to write a book. I spent like 10 hours a day writing the book. And in the end I did it. That was my first book. But it took me 6 months to edit the manuscript. Because writing the first draft is one thing, but actually to get a final product you can actually sell is another thing. But then I've been improving the process little by little through the years. So after 10 years now I'm much faster and I think much more accurate in the process. But still people should be realistic. It takes substantial work to write a book that is well documented, that is factual, that is well researched. For me, it's not something you can do in a few hours.
Right. So let's talk about your first book then, and the process. So what made you? So your first book, When Everything Fails, Try This, in 2009. What made you want to first off write that book initially? And you mentioned before having to go through this editing process, but let's just go from the beginning of you had the idea. How long did it take you to write the first one? Were you speaking with traditional publishers, or how did that work?
Yeah, the way I did it was basically to minimize research. And this is something that it's a strategy I adopted through the years, because if you try to write about subjects you ignore or you know very little, I mean, you might be curious about something, but to get to the level we can actually write confidently about it takes a lot of work. So from the very beginning, I decided to write about things I'm very familiar with. And the first book, the one you mentioned, When Everything Fails, Try This. Mm-hmm. At that moment, one of my friends died of cancer, and I was very familiar with cancer research and therapies and all kind of things that go with it. And I wrote a book in a context of territorial context I know, hospitals I know, people I know, therapists I know, trying to show in the novel what are the most promising therapies at the moment. And this is how the book came about. But when I started to write, I already knew the subject very well, because otherwise I could have spent years on research. Yeah. Even the streets and the corners I mentioned in the book, I've been there already many times. So this is for me the way to work relatively quickly. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, it is super inefficient.
Sure. How do you handle writer's block, or do you get writer's block?
No, I get zero writer's block because I work backwards. When most people get the idea to write a book, they develop a concept, and then they try to put the ideas together, and they do research, mm-hmm. and then they actually write the book. I work backwards because what I do is I'm taking notes constantly for material I read, books, magazines, blog articles, whatever. I'm taking notes constantly. So I have sufficient materials for, a dozen books in the future. So when I want to write the next one, I just look at my files, and the idea comes from the files. So I first I do the research, and then I get the idea. So for me, it's very easy to write. It's just taking the time to put it down on the page and to edit it. Mm-hmm. This is still a very difficult process.
Sure. Would you tell me more about your filing system and your sorting system? So I've heard of other writers like Robert Greene who they use like this note card idea where, like what you're doing, they collect ideas and quotes and things and they store them on these note cards. How do you store your research, and when do you know, okay, I have enough research, now I'm going to write a book about it?
I'm very systematic the way I do that. So when I read all kind of stuff all the time. I listen to podcasts, so I do all kind of research spontaneously. Mm-hmm. And when I find something interesting, I just write it down. I have like a blog, a paper, note paper, so I just write it down. I number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I number the ideas. And once a year, which is usually when I finish the book I'm writing, so once a year I just type it into, I have sort of a database, so I typed all the new ideas mm-hmm. by subjects. So they are already organized. So when I want to do my next book, actually I have planned, like the next 2 or 3 books are already planned. So I just go back to the notes that are already organized. I don't think you can actually do anything with notes that are chaotic. So I try to be super precise and super organized.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. So of the books that you've written so far, what has been your favorite one, if you have a favorite one, or which one has been the favorite to write?
Yeah, I have my favorite one and the one that sells best. Mm-hmm. They are not the same. So,
okay.
So, and I understand why, but okay. My favorite book from all the ones I've written is called The 10 Principles of Rational Living. Mm-hmm. It's a very philosophical book. It's about history, going through biographies of different people and trying to extract the principles to live a very effective life in all areas. Mm-hmm. So it took me a lot of work to put this book together. I think it's very original in the approach, but for some reason, I know why, the book that sells best is about stress. I wrote a book about stress reduction 5 years ago. The book is called Consistency, the key to long-term stress reduction, consistency.
Yeah.
And this book obviously addresses a very common problem. It has also a very original approach because it's based on history, and it got very good reviews. So this is the book that is selling best.
Yeah, excellent. So, okay, let's talk about your stress book then. So what are some key takeaways in the book about, everybody deals with some kind of stress in their life. What are some key ways to reduce stress?
Well, one of the key ways is not to fall for too much intake in terms of news.
Okay.
Because people tend to become super anxious and super stressed by reading the news in the morning, or listen to the radio, or listening to inputs of some kind that are very negative, very pessimistic, and this tends to drive anxiety to extremely high levels. Just to give you an idea, only in the U.S. you have 50 million people taking medication against stress. It's a very serious problem. It's really a very heavy medical problem.
Yeah.
And what I've done in the book is to go in history and to show different strategies, how people reduce financial stress, for instance, through diversification of assets, how people reduce also the dependency on one particular job by expanding their skills in different areas. So what I've done is to present practical strategies, how to reduce your stress in the long term.
Okay, excellent. So let's talk about your new book, or newest book that came out in January, Undisrupted, How Highly Effective People Deal with Disruptions. I know that's something that I've personally faced in my life, where I'm just going along smoothly and then everything kind of gets upended. But you bring up like Albert Schweitzer, a few other people, the Knights Templar. What was the idea behind this book, and what are some key takeaways that you want the readers to know about?
Yeah, the idea for the book, I got it while I was reading a biography. I was reading the biography of Saba Mamontov. He used to be a very well-known industrialist in the 19th century in Russia. He was building became very wealthy. He was a celebrity in his country. He was the Russian equivalent of Andrew Carnegie, building railroads. And when he was in his 40s, mid-40s, he completely collapsed. He lost everything. He started to invest in other areas he knew little about. He started steel manufacturing. And within a few years, he was prosecuted for embezzlement because he was trying to cover the losses in steel manufacturing from the money from the railroad. The shareholders got very angry. They tried him for embezzlement. Eventually, he didn't go to jail. But they took everything away from him, and he spent the last 15 years of his life in total misery. And I found this story very intriguing because Mamontov was super clever. He was a very sophisticated businessman. And the question is, how is it possible that such a clever person, such a experienced businessman can lose everything in such a stupid way? And I went through the story, and then I started to look into history, and I found a pattern. And one of the main ideas of the book is that when people go through disruptions and they come victorious and they really do very well, it is because they rely on their strengths systematically. They do not improvise. And when they get into a situation like Mamontov, where they start to do something they know very little about, they start to improvise, the result is almost always a catastrophe.
Interesting. So with this, the people that you've studied, do they already know their strengths going into it, or is it one of those things where when you hit disruption, suddenly your strength emerges?
I would say that 99% of the people in the stories do not know their strength.
Okay.
They act instinctively because, they get problems, they start to make mistake after mistake, and eventually they figure out what to do. But it's very interesting because even people who discover, let me just give you a little story.
Sure.
One of the stories in the book is about Kovalevsky. Kovalevsky was a paleontologist in the 19th century, and he was the first person in history who actually came up with the explanation how little horses in prehistory, we are talking about horses of the size of a cat, how they became the horses we see today, are very, very large animals, very strong, very fast. And until the 19th century, everybody thought that there were different species, that there was no connection because the difference in size was just too big. And the skeleton was also a bit different. And Kovalevsky, for the first time, actually he was a lawyer and then he became a scientist. Kovalevsky came up with the idea that the small horses became very big and very fast thanks to disruptions. Because when they ran out of food, they used to live in